In this week's episode, I am resharing a conversation that I had with Al and Lisa Robertson of Duck Dynasty. If you don't know anything about Duck Dynasty, several years ago, it was a TV show, a reality TV show that was taking the world by storm. And I can tell you from personal experience that this family, the Robertson family, is truly genuine and the real deal. We have actually known the Robertson family for several years, and we had the awesome opportunity a couple of years ago to even go down to New Orleans and to spend some time with the Robertsons, and got to go to Mr. Phil and Miss Kay's house and spend some time with them, which was such a great time. And I honestly, they are the real deal. And a couple of years ago, I had a conversation with Al and Lisa Robertson. Al is one of the sons of Phil and Kay, and Al and Lisa actually had their own marriage crisis. I mean, decades ago now, but they wrote a book called Desperate Forgiveness and really opened up about their story and about how Lisa had had an affair and some other things that had happened in their marriage, and actually how my parents were able to help them save their marriage based on the example that my mom had given to them of how to forgive. And they ended up writing this book called Desperate Forgiveness. And so we had an amazing conversation. Now, this is an older podcast episode. This is a rebroadcast, but I wanted to share it again now because recently my dad, Dr. Joe Beam, was invited to be on the Unashamed podcast with Phil Robertson and with Al and with Jace Robertson. And so they had him on. They talked about some marriage stuff. They talked about some spiritual warfare stuff. It was a great episode. We'll link to it in the show notes. Definitely encourage you to go listen to it. But it just reminded me of when I had Al and Lisa on, and just, don't you just love when people are genuine? And like, you know that they really are who they are and that they live the values that they say that they live. And more than that, it's a story of hope. And who doesn't love a story of hope? And deeper than that, especially when I had them on my show, I was really struggling with forgiveness from someone in my life, and had been at that point dealing with unforgiveness and holding on to unforgiveness and resentment for probably 20 years. And so it was a poignant episode for me and a helpful episode in my own healing journey of working towards forgiving some situations that happened in my life that were difficult to forgive. And I can tell you now that because of that conversation and some of the other things that happened right after that, that really spurred me towards wanting to take hold of forgiveness and live in freedom, I am not living in resentment or fear or anxiety or any of those things that were accompanied with the fact that I was living in choosing to hold on to resentment towards situations that had happened in my life. So forgiveness is powerful. And that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode. Let's dive in.
You gave me your book, Desperate Forgiveness, last year, because it was about a year ago, just over a year ago, that we were at my parents' 50th anniversary party. And it was probably, I didn't know it when you gave it to me, but oh my goodness, such a godsend. And I am embarrassed to say it wasn't until this past week that I was like, I need to read this book, because I felt like I knew your story. So I was like, I think I get it. Oh my goodness. This book is amazing in so many ways. And so now that I've read it cover to cover, one of the chapter or a couple of the chapters multiple times, I'm like, I have a whole new set of questions that I want to ask you, because it's so raw. Everything in it, everything you guys talk about and touch on, it's like, this is the real stuff that people have to deal with and forgive. And this past year of my life, I have had to come to head with so many of these things that I didn't realize I hadn't forgiven from childhood or from things that happened, you know, that people had done to me and said to me for just years. And I'm reading this book, and so many parts of it, I got emotional because I was like, this is truth. And the fact that they are putting their story on the line, the dirty, nasty, like everything that people try and hide, this book is amazing. It is amazing.
Well, we appreciate that. And, you know, I mean, obviously, and your dad and mom are gracious enough to allow us to, you know, tell some of their story as well, along with other people that have impacted us, and people that, we know their story has impacted other people. And so, it's really great that it impacts you that way, because, you're kind of a direct product of one of the things that really helped us. And that was your mom and dad finding that same way to, find their way to forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's amazing. I'm probably, as we talk, some things will come out, but what prompted you to write the book in the first place? Because you'd already written the book that was really about your story, A New Season, which in and of itself is an amazing book. And your story's amazing, and it's impacted, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So what led you to say, we're going to put it all on the line, let people know all of the things we have struggled with, and write a book about it?
So I think for us, it was probably when we had been, basically at the time about 15 or 16 years, when we, wrote our first book, removed from our own just disaster, of our marriage and everything we were trying to do, and almost lost everything. And so, that had a lot of time to sort of brew our story itself. And obviously we're on our family's on a hit television show. And so it was like, okay, God's built a platform now. We've been, doing our testimony all over the country. We've been helping couples and been just seeing amazing things happen over the course of that 15 or 16 years. And so when the time came for us to write our story, to kind of, everyone in our family was writing books, and, the public is just gobbling them up. And so we told our story, but, our story had been around a long time from our perspective. But of course, for most people, it was the first time they were hearing this stuff. The difference in Desperate was, after a couple of years went by after that book, we wanted to tell some more stories, not just ours. I mean, ours was the anchor point, because that's how we understood forgiveness the way we understand it now. But we wanted to be able to tell other stories of people we had helped, and people that had helped us, the people that we had seen, and even some people that were still trying to figure it out. They weren't there yet. Some I call them TBDs. They were to be determined, because maybe they couldn't make restitution in this life, with this situation. Maybe someone, and there's some in there about a father and a son and a dad, and not everybody's still alive. So we wanted to tell those stories along with some biblical stories that really fit the narrative. Because if you look at it, really, I mean, the Bible is just a giant book about forgiveness and redemption, and about families and nations and, people trying to figure it out. And so we wanted to tell some biblical stories in with that. So it was really kind of more of a ministry-driven idea from it. And so, our first book, we just basically told our story to a wonderful writer, and then she just, told the story, and it was powerful, and it impacted people. This one, Lisa and I were much more hands-on in putting it together, and we even presented it, all the different chapters, as like presentations here at our church, which kind of allowed us to really, work through some of our thought processes. So it was a labor of love. It took about a year to get it all together. And to be honest with you, Kimberly, we had a hard time getting it published. If folks on the family were great to come alongside us, because, people were like, all the publishers were like, well, we've already heard your story. It's great and all that, but, that dynasty's over. So we just need to, it's a great idea, but, we didn't know that we were going to have to publish it ourselves or whatever. And then Focus came along and said, we love it. It's an extension. It's a sequel, really, to your story. And so that was kind of the genesis of it and how it all came about.
I love the way it's written, because it opens with your dad, Al, right? So it sets this scene of like what your family had come through, and then what changed, what happened, but how, because of what happened with your parents, how that affected you, led you to do things you never thought that you might do, how that impacted Lisa, how Lisa's past impacted her. Like, you can start to see this spider web of how everything affects everything else, right? And then each chapter's these people, like you said, these people that you encounter that are, again, just more of these spider webs that are coming off of your story. And it all brings together this beautiful picture of forgiveness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I have so many questions I want to ask. How did
I think it's important, Kimberly, that if you're gonna if you're going to try to understand somebody, I think you've got to know their past. I think you've got to know where they're coming from, maybe a little bit of their history and what happened to them and what they've been through. Because if you don't know that, you don't understand why people react to things the way that they do. And so I believe that you've got to dive a little bit deeper into your relationships, and especially those that really matter, and find those things out, because you've got to come to a point where you understand them, and that you say, you know what, I'm not any better than anybody else. You know, this person's not any better than I am. We all go through, sorry, pardon the French, crap, you know, in our life, and we're all sinners. So we're all going to hurt one another. So you've got to get to a point where you can understand what somebody else is going through. Put yourself in their shoes and say, I get it. It's not an excuse. It's a reason. And sometimes we just have to understand the reasons why.
One of the things, Lisa, I loved about your telling of your story in here is it kind of starts, and even if you were, you know, if people just know about your marriage story, about how you had affairs, and how you almost divorced, you were separated, all those things, even as you say in this book, Desperate Forgiveness, if you were to just start there and not go backwards to see, as you were just saying, why that was happening, then people judge, right? They totally do. People might judge and say, you can't ever trust Lisa again. Don't go back to her. I'm sure there are people who said that in y'all's marriage.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But when you begin to peel back these layers, and then, Lisa, you go into the struggles with your relationship with your mom, how that affected you and impacted you, the sexual abuse that you had to endure and keep your mouth shut. How did you how did your journey go with this? Where was there just a day it all came together to you as to why you were feeling this way and doing these things? Or did it just take time to piecemeal it all together? Or did you know the whole time that is what was affecting you and causing you to make some of these decisions you were making?
No, actually, we had no idea why either one of us made the decisions that we made until we went to a wonderful counselor. I think everybody needs a counselor at some point in their life, just somebody that can guide them. And that's what a counselor does. They just guide. They guide you to a point where you can understand things about your past, and how your past and the decisions that were made for you, even when you're a child, the decisions that you made as a teenager, how all of that intermingles and it affects who you are as an adult. And I think that's why we have to talk about that past, because we need to understand where we came from and what the journey was and what happened during the journey.
A lot of times too, Kimberly, I think it depends on the depth of the hurt in someone's life. Obviously, what happened to Lisa was so traumatic and deep and secretive for so many years. It was going to take some time for her to get to some place where she could look at that and see how that impacted her, and then how it was impacting us, how she viewed other men, how she viewed me, and she'd kind of put me as her, it was kind of her white knight or savior, which sounds okay until you realize there's only one, and it's not your husband or your wife. And so I think part of that is the depth of hurt. That's why sometimes we always say now, one of our mottos about forgiveness is aim small, miss small, because, we would rather deal with something before, it becomes so big that then it takes time to get back to the depth of it. And so I think there's a lot of people walking around in relationships and their marriage, and they still have, some old wounds and some things that they've just kind of shuttered away. And then it's affecting how they're living their life now. And yet they don't always make that link. So in Lisa's case, and same with your dad, it took a complete brokenness. I mean, it got to be in the point where I've lost everything that matters to me. And so now I'm ready to figure out why. And for, unfortunately, a lot of people have to go there. I have to go to the place that I'm about to lose everything. In your dad's case, he had already lost his family, but he was about to lose his life. And then it was like, okay, I've got to take the look. I've got to figure out what is this hole that's in my heart, in my soul, that I cannot fill up with anything else, even though I keep trying to.
Mm-hmm. How long, Lisa, and then I have the same question for you in a different way, Al, but how long did it take for you to get to the point where you could forgive your abuser and then to forgive your mother?
I would say probably, it took 35 years for me to be able to forgive my abuser, because that's when I started counseling, was whenever I was 35. And, then I think probably a few years after that, although I knew my mother was not at fault for what happened to me, as a child, I thought, well, she should have known. She should have inquired. Now, as a parent and as a grandparent, I realized, that wasn't the case, that, she really had no idea. And so I think probably, it took probably 8 months of counseling before we ever totally got to the point where we said, okay, it's time to forgive. We can do this, And I think, the forgiveness, it's an everyday thing, because you have to wake up every day and decide if you're going to pick that burden back up or if you're going to leave it at the foot of the cross. And, some days you pick it back up, only to leave it, midway through the day and say, okay, I can't deal with this anymore. But it's a day-to-day thing. Something might pop up about my mother, and I have to consciously say to myself, you forgave your mom. That it's not about that. Or something will happen, and I'm talking to some young woman who, was sexually assaulted as a child or molested. And then I have to, a thought will come through my head about my uncle, and I'm like, no, I've already forgiven that. I can't pick that back up. So I would say, it's an ongoing thing every day, but it took about 8 months of counseling before I could get to the point and see my own sin in my life. I think that was another thing. I had to see the sin that I had also. And just through intensive counseling, that's probably about how long it took for me to say, all right, I'm ready to forgive.
And I will say something to add to that, Kimberly. Our counselor was wonderful in the idea that she helped us see that, because we had I'll never forget it in the session. It was one of those, watershed moments during our path, during that time. And this has been 21 years ago, and I still remember. There was an empty chair she had brought into the room, and she wanted us to imagine him in that chair, which was very difficult for both of us. Because, from Lisa's perspective, he was a monster. From my perspective, I wanted to, be the Lord's, vengeance on him.
Right.
And yet she convinced us that the forgiveness wasn't about him, because he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He's never even fully admitted anything. But the forgiveness was for us to be released, because this curse, had gripped Lisa for most of her life, and now me with it because of us. So that's a big point in the book, about that the forgiveness that you offer is as much about yourself as it is about the other person. Obviously, you hope to restore the relationship and go forward. In our case, we don't want a relationship with this person, and as far as I know, in this life, it'll never be restored, but we needed the freedom from that. And so many people are held captive by that. So it was interesting, because it's kind of ironic, because we were talking about our mom. When we did our first book, the writer, of course, is just hearing the story, and it's raw. I love the way he described our story. And so when we read the first version, when Lisa was, telling about her mom and her upbringing, we looked at each other and we were like, oh my goodness, we're going to have to soften this because, her mom's still alive and, this is going to be bad. And so we softened it as much as we could and yet still were truthful. And yet even then her mom was livid. I mean, she hated it because, she just didn't want, she would rather never talk about anything. And so that actually, our first book is what then led to a really division between Lisa and her mom, between me and her mom. And so until she got sick, really, to the point, where Lisa stepped back in to take care of her, she didn't want a relationship with us. It was awful. It was terrible. And so, but Lisa and I had to make a decision. I mean, are we going to, live this forgiveness out? And so we both had to make that decision. So it's really about just a few weeks before she passed away. It was getting where Lisa would have to take her to the ER, but they couldn't do anything. She had COPD, and they would give her a steroid thing for treatment and then breathing treatment. She'd be a little better, but she wasn't getting any better. And so Lisa was going to be stuck up there. We just sat down in church on a Sunday, and, she gets the call. The ambulance is picking your mom up. And I knew that was an afternoon for Lisa sitting at the ER. And at that point, I had not been doing much with her mom because it was just kind of more peaceful for everybody if I didn't. But I thought, Lisa's going to be sitting there all day and her mom will just be out because of whatever they give her to calm her down. And so I just went up to sit with Lisa. And so we're sitting there together, working on our computer, working on our schedule. And her mom wakes up and she looks over and sees me there because I wasn't there when she went to sleep. And this is classic her. And I'm going to say it just like she said it. But she said, she looked over at me and she kind of has a scowl look on her face. She said, do you think you can forgive me for all the hell I put you through? I mean, that was her line, just literally out of a sleep. And it kind of took me back, that she asked me that. And I said, well, sure, Molly, I already have. I said, will you forgive me for any hurts that I brought to you? She said, yeah, I reckon so. I said, well, good. And that was it. Like, it wasn't like, we didn't hug and, the puppies didn't run out and, hearts go through the room. It was kind of our classic way that she and I communicated. But that was a huge moment for her and for me because it was just a reminder, like Lisa said, that, and, look, I'm the one that's preached her funeral. And I'm the one that had to look at her brother, Lisa's abuser, who was in the audience, And so, in moments like that, or when you decide, did I really forgive or not? And he was acting like a jerk. And so, that whole day I was just in prayer. I had people praying over me, to be God's man, to live the forgiveness that we extended, and sometimes it's hard when you have to face something like that.
So hard. As I was reading the book, there's specific situations that came to my mind, the harder things in my life I've had to forgive. And I said, this past year, it's all kind of come to a head for me. Back when I was 12, or starting when I was 12, there was a person in my life who began sexually harassing me and saying things they should not say to a 12-year-old. And I never said anything about it to anyone and then just carried it with me. And it was a person who was close to my family, so they never really went away. And it wasn't until, throughout my several years of marriage to my husband, every so often I would talk about this, like, I was just so angry about it. And he would say, you need to forgive him. And I was like, I have forgiven him. But in my mind, because in my mind, I was like, I don't want to think about it. I don't even want to go back there. I don't even, I really didn't want to address it. But this past year, everything came to such a head where it's like, you couldn't ignore it anymore. And so even as the book begins and it talks about this desperate need for forgiveness, and it can look different in everyone's life, right? Like, a person who's done something and they need desperately to be forgiven. Or in my case, while yes, I had done things, like the bigger thing for me was I am living in a state of anger and resentment and hate, really, towards this person. And it was hurting me as a person to keep carrying that with me. And so I was like, I've got to figure out how in the world to forgive. And it was one of the hardest things I've had to do.
Yeah.
Why do you
see, you were living as a victim and not as a victor. Once you extend that forgiveness, you become a victor. And what they did to you can no longer harm you. You're not being held hostage, by the memories and not being able to tell anybody. And so, but a victim mentality, we see that every day on the news. It'll kill you. It will drive you insane.
Yeah.
And so you were living as a victim since you were 12 years old. And now you're living as a victor since you have forgiven this person. You will use that hurt now to help other people. Whereas before, all that hurt did was hurt you and make you bitter and angry.
Mm. And that's, as I was reading all of these stories in this book, I couldn't help but think how much more, and this is one of the questions I have for y'all, it's hard. Like it has to be hard to think about it, to talk about it. But is it so much easier? And have you reframed it that every time you speak about it and talk about what's happened, that it really is more of this like invigorating, look what we have done, look what God has done through us, look the amazing things that ended up coming from this. Do you think that's helped heal you and helped you forgive even more?
No doubt about it. And I think that's why, because, we've been doing this 20 years now and telling our story. And it also includes abortion. There's a lot of bad stuff, that's in our past and Lisa's past. But, when we're able to show and talk about what God has done over that process and then what he has allowed us to do in the book, we talk about a couple that had a situation as bad or worse than ours. And we walked through that with them, and they were able to find forgiveness. And now they're leading our marriage ministry here at our church. We were doing live stream, during the coronavirus, and we just guested on their live stream. And, every time I'm with them, I just marvel because they basically took over for us when God kind of put us out on the national stage to do things around the country. We couldn't do as much locally here. And, we love our community and our church, but God raised them up to do just what you were talking about. And yes, the way I compare it to, I say it's like a wound that healed, like a surgical wound or whatever. And then you have that hard, scar tissue that's there. And so we feel like they keeps you from re-entering that spot. And we feel like that's what way we are spiritually. Like every time we help someone, every time we speak, every time we do a podcast like yours, what we're doing is we're putting another layer of that good, healthy scar tissue, because we'll never forget the wound. We'll never forget what it was like to go through that. But we need to, because I was just talking to a guy from Alabama who his wife left him, and he's 2 weeks removed from it. Well, of course, I remember what that was like. But if I don't remember that, and I'm not able to tell him and give him some hope, then in that moment, in that crisis, in those early days and weeks and months, when you go to sleep thinking about it, you wake up thinking about it, someone needs to hear that you can get past this, and it can be put back together. It may not, but it can be. And I use your parents a lot as that, even if you're divorced. Sometimes God can still work it out for people. And your result, if it hadn't been for that, you wouldn't even be here, Kimberly. So, praise God for that, right?
No, absolutely. In those moments, though, you said we try to forget, you can't forget. You talk about that even at the end of your book. And do y'all ever get to points now, even though you have done the hard work, the forgiveness, you speak on national stages, you are all about this, but do you ever have those moments where that hurt comes up again and you're starting to live in fear of what if it happens again? What if, Lisa were to have another affair? What if something else were to happen that, in my family that would just cause so much hurt? Do you ever live with the fear of the hurt?
I actually do not live in fear of that happening again. I think one thing is because when you put on the full armor of God, I didn't have the full armor of God on. I didn't really even have a relationship with God. But I believe that whenever you put on that full armor, you're going to stumble, you're going to fall, but you're not ever going to just fall into a pit. As long as you're putting in the words that come from God as long as you're studying His Word, reading things that have a positive twist to them, to teach you how to live and how to live a Christian life better than what you did yesterday, And so I do not live in fear. I don't live in fear of Alan doing that. He's not that kind of person, although it could happen to anybody. Mm-hmm. But still, Kimberly, I do not live in fear of anything. Sometimes, I pray for the Lord to put a hedge of protection. I do that every night. Please put a hedge of protection around my kids and my grandkids. I certainly, that if I had a fear, that would be it, that something would happen to them. But as far as our relationship, I have no fear whatsoever. I feel as though I can tell Alan anything. I feel like he can tell me anything. And whatever it is, we're going to get past it. And, my life now it's just totally different. I lived so long in fear because when you live with secrets, they're almost like time bombs, and you never really know when they're going to detonate. Yeah. And so there are no secrets anymore. There's the past is the past. We have gotten past the past, and we can't change it. All we can do is live glorified from now on. So I really have no fear.
I think honesty and truth have definitely been the two factors, and we talk about that a lot in the book, obviously, because we live with so much dishonesty and not being truthful, both of us, early in our marriage, that those two things are just like a light that shines on darkness, and it really keeps fear at a minimum. And for me personally, certainly it was a lot harder early to trust Lisa, and I knew it would be. And that's why I just had to really double down in my own heart with the Almighty and just say, look, God, I'm going to doubt. There's, because I don't trust her at all, but I trust you. And I know that you revealed this to me. And so that was how I was able to navigate those early weeks and months when we weren't together, or the first time I had to go on a, mission trip or something, to be able to deal with that, because it was, it was very hard. So I get it when people say, and they talk about how hard it is to trust again. I understand completely. But I'm telling you, we're an example that over time of living truth, then that becomes much easier as you go. And I would say we're as healthy at 21 years as we've, been since we started. 21 years since it all happened.
Yeah. 36 years.
36
we'll have this year.
That's right. Lord willing.
One of the other stories that really caught my attention in this book was what you saw happen to your parents as you were growing up. Did you have, and you can summarize what that is, but my question is, did you have difficulty forgiving your dad for the things that had happened in your childhood?
Yeah, no doubt. And again, it was one of those things where Lisa was describing, I didn't even know that I was as upset and angry with him as I was, because, I still looked up to him. I still thought he was amazing, and still his life change when it changed was so incredible. But I still held a lot of that stuff in. And I think it's what led me to sort of my prodigal wandering with some pent-up stuff against him. And Mom and I have always been close and still are. But it kind of took me getting to that place where then I didn't trust myself or him or anybody. And then when I came back, he was right there to greet me. And so it was amazing. I think I was able to, in that moment, move past a lot of stuff without really even saying that or talking about it. But I think that's exactly when it happened for me, was when that happened. And, it was interesting because we were talking about it, I think, before we started recording, but we just found out that I have a new sister that was from that era. She's 44 years old, and the year she was born in 1975 was the same year that he turned his life around. And which, the way she puts it now, she says it's very comforting to know that the year I was born was the year that he was reborn. Which is really interesting. And so, I think what's interesting about that, though, is that I watched my mom, because I'm the one that told them about Phyllis. And so, to go in there that night, Lisa and I went in, and this is the conversation 45 years removed that we have to have. And so I wound up hearing things in that conversation that I've never heard in my life, because we're trying to figure out, is this true or not? And Phyllis had sent some things that her mom had said about that period of time. Well, Dad was out of his mind during that period of time, so he doesn't remember any details. What was interesting is that Mom wasn't, though. She wasn't drinking and drugging during that era, and so she remembered everything. And so it was a I don't know how to describe it. It was a surreal experience for Lisa and I, because this is your parents, and yet we're having to go back, into that era of life that Dad has been open for 44 years that he was a terrible person, but we don't know any details from it. And now we got a detail. But what really amazed me that I wanted to say to your audience today is that when someone has said they forgive somebody, and when it's put to the test, even 44 years later, you'll know it in that moment. And so what was interesting was, even though Mom was giving the details about because we're just trying to say, are we going to do the DNA test? What are we going to do? Mom was thrilled about Dad having a daughter and couldn't wait to meet her, even though we didn't even know yet. That was her reaction. And so I walked away, and she didn't say, Phil, I can't believe you did, you were such a bad person. Now look, you've upset our lives, which again, any wife that would feel that way, I'm not saying, or husband, if you find out terrible information, I'm not saying it wouldn't be upsetting, but I just marveled that my mom exhibited in the hot white moment of this truth, or potential truth at that time, that she still displayed that, well, I forgave him 44 years ago. And she meant it, because now, even though we never knew we had a sister, she couldn't wait to meet her. And she was even a little bit upset with Dad, because she said, I've always wanted a girl. And, and so Dad's like, well, Miss Guy, I didn't know, but it was just such a moment. I've thought about it since. And even the moment when Phyllis came down for the first time and met Dad, and we'd already been prepping her. Dad's not very touchy and feely and emotional, and he just comes over and grabs her hands and hugs her and holds her hand in her face in his hands, and it was just so tender, and he wanted to talk to her alone, and I know why. He wanted to say, I'm sorry I wasn't there for your life, and I don't know what all they talked about. I didn't ask, but it was a very cathartic, cleansing, amazing moment for our whole family. And now she's a part of us. It's amazing. We've been on vacations together. She's moving here in a couple of weeks and going to live here. She's like, I didn't have a relationship with my dad and my brothers for 44 years, but I have one now. So I say all that to say, to your point, that I think that's just been one more thing and a reminder for me also that I really forgave Dad a long time ago and have been living and walking this with him. In fact, we do so many projects together now and things. And look, Dad's quirky, and he's probably like your dad. They say things sometimes you're like, man, could we just soften that a little? It's just so you're always trying to, because you're like, we got to live in this society. But at the same time, it's without that, if you're carrying that along, those hurts and wounds because parents are imperfect, it's gonna, at some point, it's gonna cause problems for you.
And one of the things y'all talk about as well are these generational sins, right? But even the flip of that, like things that happen even in your family. Al, your dad had affairs, that's something that's permeated into different ways in y'all's family with Lisa, and even how you cheated on her when you were dating. Like, you can see how that can continue to happen until, like y'all said, you address it, you stop it, and you change, you forgive, you find a different way. But even as you were just saying, the opposite is true too, right? The generational blessings, like Kay, her reaction to this, her reaction to taking your dad back. How much did that impact you to forgive Lisa, take her back? And then there's this new child, this new sister that comes in the picture. Everyone is already forgiven. You embrace her with open arms. And it's just the opposite of generational sin. and these generational blessings from, and then y'all's grandchildren are seeing how your family is reacting to this. So then when they experience things like this in their life, how much more willing are they going to be to forgive, to do things, in a way that is loving and treating with kindness? And it continues to multiply.
It's a great point, and you're exactly right. You're actually flipping what the evil one loves to do, and that's generationally continue to curse families, countries, societies, cultures. I mean, he's just a master at it, and just staying in that cycle. Lisa and I are always so burdened, and we try to do everything we can, but her family, we see so many, there's generational curses, a lot of, for different, wings of the family that they just stay in that cycle, and they just cannot find their way out. Yeah. And, it hurts you when it's people you love and obviously care about it. And you know the way out, the way to flip that and to make it different and to change how we react and how we respond. And you're exactly right. And look, you're going to have new threats that come in. The evil one's going to try some different tactic from time to time. And when that happens, you still got to rely on what got us here. We had a neat moment this past year where my 14-year-old granddaughter wanted to get baptized. And so, she'd been talking about it at camp and some different things. And so she's, I would talk to her some, and, her dad and her other grandpa. But she wound up one day, Dad was over, and they got to talking about it. And so then she came to me and she said, "Do you think Papa Phil would baptize me?" I said, "Well, sure he will." And so we had this, we all gathered up, all our family around our hot tub, because it was back in the winter. And Dad baptized her. And, we videoed it. And but in the moment of when it was happening, I was just in tears, because I thought, isn't this what it should be, that a great grandfather could have a connection with his great granddaughter, and so much so at a spiritual level that she would request that he would be there for a moment like that? And it was just a flood of blessing to think that we're represented by 4 generations standing around this hot tub, of looking and seeing what happens when Christ really does change a person. And then that person then helps impact all the way 4 generations into the future.
Mm-hmm. It really does. What about when people don't have a relationship with Jesus? How do you convey the importance of forgiveness without that?
Well, I think there's still a need for that. I think we are seeing that right now in our country, because, people are pulling up things from people's past. And we were just actually talking about this morning. They'll pull up things that they did as a teenager and use it against them now, and they could be our age in their 50s. But why should we have to be defined by our past? Mm-hmm. But if you cannot forgive, then that's exactly what you are. You are defined by your past, or you define other people by their past. And so even if you don't have a relationship, with Jesus, the importance of forgiveness is still there, because it does something within you. Mm-hmm. And it makes you not be angry or bitter, and you're not a victim anymore.
Because as we know, just because we're believers doesn't mean, Lisa and I was working for the church and preaching and, teaching and doing ministry when we fell apart. So even just knowing who Jesus is and understanding it doesn't always impact you until you're ready to be impacted. And so what I would say is, I think it's easier if we can see it like we do in the Bible, and, obviously from a spiritual lens, but at the same time, people still have a spiritual quality about them, whether they're believers in Christ or not, and still need this. So all the principles still apply to help people. And, Lisa and I speak in a lot of, public gatherings and settings and capitals and around the country. And a lot of times they're not, religious settings or even, spiritual settings. And yet we still tell our story, and it still impacts people, and people still walk away from there saying, you know what, I think we can do that. And so we want to get to people where they are. And one of the things we have to watch out for sometimes as believers and church members like we are, is that a lot of times, they won't come to where you're meeting because they don't feel worthy. And so they're out there living that life, wishing they could be better. And so that's why we have to do what you're doing. You have to do podcasts. You have to do ways to get out there to where folks are. And our podcast, which is called Unashamed, is doing just that. I mean, it's amazing, the impact, right? And it's just a big Bible study, Robertson style, but we're able to do that basically on a secular political platform. Mm-hmm. And yet we're able to get the gospel out, and help people and offer them hope. So I think that's the way we have to view it, even as believers. And obviously we want to lead people to that relationship, because if you understood Jesus better, then it would really help you, And so a lot of the stories in the book, as you know, the biblical stories, are from his interactions with people. Mm-hmm. And when he's with that woman in Luke 7, or he's with that woman in John 8, and these people that are just in this broken, desperate place. Here's the Son of God who has no sin, and yet he's the most empathetic person that's ever lived for sinners. Mm-hmm. And when I sign our book, Desperate Forgiveness, I try to come up with a verse to sign every book uniquely, because I've always felt like there was something that motivated me biblically to write a book. And so for that one, I picked out Luke 7:47. And in that verse, Jesus tells Simon in that story, Simon's sitting there judgmental, and who is this person, and why is she even in here? And this guy can't be religious, or, he can't be spiritual because he wouldn't be living this woman in his midst, just basically just being a judgmental Pharisee, hypocrite. Jerk. Yeah. And then this woman is there, and he looks at Simon and he says, to the person who has been forgiven much, they will love much, which this woman is just pouring it out on Jesus. But to the person who has been forgiven little, and he didn't say it, but he was like, that's you, bud, they will love little. And it was evidence because this man had no empathy for this woman or situation or anything else, and yet Jesus did. And so to me, that really sums up what we're trying to say in the book. One of the funny things that happened, though, sometimes when we first started signing the first couple of gatherings we had and we were selling the book, I accidentally wrote John 7:47. I got my books mixed up because of the woman in John 8. And so I didn't realize that after I had a bunch of books out there that I signed the wrong verse. And of course, I guess nobody contacted me, so I don't know if they looked it up or what, but then it hit me one day. I was like, oh no, what does that verse say? So I turned over there and looked, and it says, has he deceived you as well? Retorted the Pharisee. And so I thought, man, those 200 people, if somebody did look that verse up, they're going to think, what in the world does this have to do with forgiveness? Has he deceived you as well? Retorted I never even knew the word retorted was in the Bible.
Right. Oh my goodness. I love that. Well, at the end of the book, y'all talk about these 13 disciplines of forgiveness. And I was even rereading them right before we all started back together. When you all think of forgiveness, what do you think is the most important thing for people to know and do?
I think the most important thing is to start now, start today. And I say that because, we can put it off till tomorrow. We might not feel like it tomorrow, and then we're going to say we're going to put it off till the next day. Well, I really don't feel like it, So I say just start today, and start small. Start with, start with yourself. Yourself. It's one of the hardest things to do is to forgive yourself for some of the stupid things that you've done in your life. Mm-hmm. That's not a small feat to say forgive yourself, but you've got to start somewhere, and you start with small things, work up to the big things, or tackle that one big thing, that continues to plague you, continues to bring you back under the control of the person who hurt you, which is what's happening. And so I just say start now. Today is a great day to start forgiveness for the rest of your life. But it's an everyday thing. You decide every day if you're going to forgive or not. So, but today is a great day to start.
And I think for me, it's a concept that I first got actually from your dad's book, which originally was called Forgiven Forever. And now it's called Getting Past Guilt. But it was a huge blessing in mine and Lisa's early walk, and that's why we recommend it. I have I keep a box full, that I give away to people. And in one of those chapters, he told a tremendous story that I've used so many different times. I've told him this before about a guy that just couldn't get past something. He tells this wonderful story that spans over 15 years or whatever, and this, he just couldn't get past this seemingly simple, just get over it type thing. And at the end of the story, he says, in kind of the aha moment, and that your dad was working with this guy who just couldn't forgive himself, for this thing that seemed to your dad as a minor thing, but to this guy it was a huge thing. He just couldn't get past it. And he said, what would you say if your son reacted? And he had told this great story. And he said, I would say he didn't believe his daddy. And then Joe said, well, I think you've got to believe that your God is big enough. And so I really, that's always stuck with me, because for forgiveness, he keeps saying, if you think you're forgiven, you can forgive others. That's how it works. And so I think that's a first big step for people, is to be able, like Lisa said, to say, okay, you know what, God, I believe you're big enough to forgive me for things I've done wrong. So that helps me be able to then forgive other people. And so, and another thing is, I always tell people the words are important. Anything, when you get married, you say the words. When you become a Christian, you say the words. Jesus is Lord. I think it's important to say the words. People a lot of times just say, well, we're past that. But nobody ever said, will you forgive me? And the other person says, yes, I do. I think the words are important because they're a reminder. And so Lisa and I, through the years, obviously started with one big, huge event. But one thing we've kept consistent for 21 years is that we say the words. You're cross, you snap and say something you wish you hadn't said, and you said, I'm so sorry, I wish I hadn't said that. It's okay. I understand. We were having a tough moment there, but I forgive you. And so we try to, after all these years, to say the words out loud. And that's what stores up in your heart. That's the things you want to remember when you think about my spouse. They love me. They're willing to say I was wrong, and they're willing to say I forgive you.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things that this book, and even Lisa, something you said at the beginning of this, was saying it really, putting yourself to where you can see the perspective or the past of another person. And it's not just our spouse, right, that we need to watch our words towards or make sure. But, when you were talking about how your youngest brother was born after all the stuff that happened with your parents, and there was a time where you really had to come face to face with how you couldn't believe he was taking advantage of the fact that he got two parents that were together and happy and didn't have to live through all that poverty and just all the things. As I was reading that, I immediately began thinking about my family and my sister. Because, as both of you know, I have two older sisters that experienced my parents' divorce, and my oldest sister is mentally handicapped, so she doesn't remember it the same way. But my middle sister, Joanna, she remembers all of it. And to the extent where even for a couple of years growing up, when I was a teenager and I would try to talk to her about it, she had just totally pushed it down and said, I don't really remember it. I don't really know. But then if she would ever hear my parents talking about it, or people come to her and ask her about it, she would just cry. She couldn't deal with it. And so for my sister and I, of course, there was a large age gap, 12 years, but there's also always been something else there. And it's another one of those things that's kind of come up more over this past year, where I've had to see through a different perspective of, she sees my life a little bit differently, and I see her life a little bit differently. And I haven't always taken into account the hurt that she's had to go through, the betrayal she's had to go through. And I've always felt like my parents treated her too nicely, whereas they would typically, make me do the harder stuff, or, they would hold me to all A's or all of those things. But Joanna, I felt like she got off the hook with a lot of that. But I didn't realize everything that went into that. And so I had been probably too hard on my sister and on my parents at how they had treated my sister, how she got away with so much. And I felt like I had to be this golden child until I really just started putting the perspective into those shoes, into my dad's shoes of, gosh, like imagine how he felt of what he did. And then with me, there was this chance, kind of, so to say, of being able to be the dad and being totally there that he didn't have with my sister. And then for my sister, just understanding what she had gone through. And so even though a beautiful testimony has come through my parents' story, it's still hard. And that and there's still things that we as a family struggle with and we have to forgive and we have to move past. But when you see it from the other's perspective, how much easier it is to forgive whatever happens, bring it to light, talk about it, don't keep putting things under the rug. And I love the way that your family has done it. I love the way my family has done it, even in the hard times, even in the difficult times. But I so believe that it's when we're able to talk about it with each other, but even talk about it with like you do to others, the testimony that's come from it, what you've come through, what God can do. That's where huge change happens.
Yeah, no doubt. And the empathy is the word that always comes to my heart and mind when I think about that. And you're right. I talk about in the book, I kind of lost sight of that, I think, some in Jep's life. And then I realized, that he was, we were just two kids that struggled. We had four of us and everybody has sins and struggles, but Jep and I kind of went off the reservation. But just because he was raised in a better situation didn't mean that he had to find that, and so he and Dad, we're very different because like Dad and I don't touch or hug or, I could be shaking hands in a line. Dad's there, he'd just shake my hand or typically wouldn't do anything. And yet, Jep comes in and just hugs him. And when he was up until he was a teenager, sat on his lap. And it was just a different, and it was foreign to me because I just never saw that way, but Jep did. And so it's been interesting. And then even Phyllis coming in now, and she's kind of not a touchy-feely person either. She's a lot like Dad like that, which is kind of funny. But she loves to be with him. They'd sit and talk. And so when I pull up and they're just sitting out on the front porch when they'd come down to visit, I don't know, it just able to see that, you're right, having that idea that people, have different experiences. And we saw that with our kids. I mean, our oldest has always been kind of insecure about her mom because her greatest fear is that, she thought it was over during that period. She was about, I don't think 12 or 13 years old when all that happened. And so even to this day, she's an adult. She's been married 16 years. She's got 3 kids, but she's always, you can tell she's like, I always want to be aware of where Lisa is because she carries that insecurity. And we've never really talked about it. She's never said anything about it, we may be wrong, but Lisa and I both think that's because it goes back to that time of difficulty for our marriage. And I think she carries that with her. My youngest daughter is more butt heads with Lisa. But she was a lot more angry about then because she felt like nobody was sticking up for me, like people were trying to help her mom, but what about Dad, And so, it's just interesting watching them now as adults, as wives, as mothers, but still carry, like you said, some of those things from family hurts and mistakes that you just, again, that's the only thing you can do. Now, I'm sure, I know that both the girls have forgiven their mom for all that years ago, but it doesn't mean that sometimes you don't carry some consequences of how you react and, your behavior.
Absolutely. Well, I love this book, clearly. All day, I'm just, I can't wait now to ask them so many things. And I know you hear it from so many people, but I really thank you for putting your story on the line and being so open with all of it. And it's what I believe we need to do as Christians, right? Instead of hiding behind this perfect picture, like this is the reality of what life is like. And here's how Jesus redeems all of it. And you do it so beautifully in your story. And you talk about it so well in this book.
Well, we appreciate it. And you know what? That's the reason why we wrote it, is that so it would impact people and help them. And so it's a book. I always said that if somebody buys it, that's great. But I hope they we'll give it to somebody else. And so
Mm-hmm.
even if we only sell through one time and then everybody passes it around to other people, that's the goal for us.
I hope you enjoyed this recap and recast of my episode with Al and Lisa Robertson. And man, aren't they amazing? Aren't they a great couple? I encourage you to get their book, Desperate Forgiveness, and read it and take hold of the truths in it as a story of hope and the things that can apply to your own life. And again, if you would like to hear about when Joe was on the Unashamed podcast just recently, we've included that in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy listening to that conversation. If you believe that this episode would be helpful to a friend or someone else in your life that you could share it with, then please do so. And as always, one of the best ways that you can support this podcast is by leaving a review. Until next week, stay strong.